people love stories. And stories only operate well if they have some sort of climax, a moment that everything is heading towards. And some stories do it so well that when you get to the climax and you see it, everything that led up to it makes so much more sense. And everything that comes after it is made more clear. It's like the movie The Usual Suspects that came out in the 1990s. That all throughout the movie, you aren't really sure what to expect. And then all of a sudden, the big moment is revealed and everything makes so much sense. I'm not gonna spoil it for you, okay? But the moment is iconic. So much so that other movies have riffed off of it. So there's a classic thing of this person, a detective, looking at his wall, trying to figure out what's going on. And then it goes into slow-mo and his coffee slowly falls out of his hand. He drops his mug and the wheels start turning in his brain and he figures out what actually was going on all along. This is what the climax is supposed to do. Everything was leading to it, and now everything makes sense. In chapter 7, we are invited into a scene in which a minister of the church, Stephen, is interrogated for speaking against the Torah, which is the law of Moses, and against the temple. And in response, Stephen tells a story. Stephen's story is about the history of Israel from the time of Abraham to the time of Jesus. He mentions a lot of people and events, but he draws everyone's attention to two people in particular. The two people that get the most attention are Joseph and Moses. In both situations, when it comes to these two different people in the Old Testament, Stephen highlights them the most because they have something in common. They are both deliverers of Israel, and yet they are rejected. Joseph comes to the aid of his family by saving them from the famine, and yet, though, he's rejected by his family before them. Moses comes to the Israelites, tries to help them in a dispute, and yet he's rejected in that moment. And yet he goes on to be a deliverer of Israel from Egypt. Leaders sent by God to save others who were eventually rejected. Sound familiar? The objects that Stephen brings up ends up being the instruction of the Lord, Torah, and the temple. The two things that Stephen is being accused of blaspheming against. But what Stephen notes is that these two objects were not to be seen as the most important things, but actually they were a means to an end. The law of Moses spoke of a great prophet to come that would be like Moses, like a deliverer. The temple pointed to where God dwelled, not in the temple, but actually in heaven, where according to Acts 1:7 is where Jesus resides on his throne. What Stephen is saying is that Israel's history has been heading towards a climax, and the climax of the history is Jesus. That Jesus is the king sent by God to deliver the people, but is rejected. But even though he's rejected, he yet still fulfills his mission and delivers people who follow him. That he is the great prophet, the fulfillment of the Torah, that he is God. And Stephen ends his sermon by telling the people that they should not respond like those of old responded to Joseph and Moses and the prophets, but should accept Jesus as ruler, as king, and deliverer. That Jesus is the prize, greater than Torah and the temple. He is the climax that makes everything before and after make sense. That he, as we will see, is truly worth dying for. But he's not just worth dying for, Jesus is worth living for. He is to be the climax of our story too, the goal of our days. Oftentimes we can approach Jesus as if he is a means to an end, that we want Jesus because he gets us something else. He gets us out of hell. He gets us into God's grace. He gets us to blessings. But that's not how we are to approach this story. Just like Joseph and Moses, just like the Torah and the temple all led to Jesus, our lives are to lead to Jesus. So we live the story of Acts 7 by pursuing Jesus because we recognize he is the prize. What Stephen testifies to us is that Jesus is the prize, worth dying for, and truly worth living for.